All right, it's a Wednesday night at 9 o'clock Eastern Time. That means only one thing. We're talking SEC football. It's SEC Breakdown with Mike Loveall and also David Waters. I'm Mark Rogers, talking up the SEC 24/7, 365. So we've got much to talk about, despite football being far, far away still. Some unfortunate circumstances involving maybe the SEC's best pro prospect in Laremy Tunsil. Going to talk some scheduling later because there's some hypothetical proposals out there in regards to alternate scheduling for the SEC. And of course, we just made our way through another big NFL draft weekend with the SEC having the most selections out of the Power 5 conferences with 51. All right, Dave, let's turn toward this Orlando Sentinel column that came out a few days ago involving Hugh Freeze's 2013 recruiting class and just his overall practices and approach there at Ole Miss being a bit under question. And at that point, obviously, Jim McElwain was being hired just in the last couple of years at Florida. Hugh Freeze might have been a candidate, possibly was a candidate, but not the best of reputations, kind of stemming from the question surrounding his tactics in hauling in that famed 2013 recruiting class and what may be a building reputation that cost him elsewhere.
Right, it's Mike Bianchi from Orlando Sentinel, very well-known columnist here in the state of Florida, and he's been everywhere in the state of Florida, here in Jacksonville, now in Orlando, and now it's he's pretty much saying the controversy surrounding Laremy Tunsil, and quote, is essentially why the Florida Gators never considered hiring Ole Miss head coach Hugh Freeze. I'll admit Hugh Freeze was very high on my list. As Florida was looking for the next coach following Will Muschamp's firing. But I did keep thinking about we kept hearing these rumors and about how Ole Miss was recruiting so well and how they got the Laremy Tunsils and the Quan Treadwells of the world. And Tunsil just went to high school right down the road here in Jacksonville. And we've heard a lot of stories coming from it looked like Tunsil was a Georgia lock, and all of a sudden he's going to Ole Miss, and he grew up a Gator fan, and it was probably Florida and then a lot to Georgia, and somehow he ends up at Ole Miss. And we see with the fallout from the supposed text messages that were going on between Ole Miss officials and Tunsil, and maybe some money going to Tunsil's way when he needed some help. It kind of was a thorn in the side of another thorn in the side of Hugh Freeze, and going with that the rumor of maybe some negative stuff going on. Mike Bianchi later on in his article, quote, after Florida hired McElwain, UF athletic director Jeremy Foley told me that some potential coaching candidates had been eliminated because of character issues. Although Foley never mentioned Freeze by name, it's quite clear now why the Ole Miss coach was never a candidate to coach the Gators. I'm not going to take that as fact. I think that's Bianchi's opinion, but I think a lot of people have that opinion of Hugh Freeze, and why maybe Jeremy Foley was looking the other way. Foley needed to get this hire right, and I think with the rumors swirling around of the negative maybe recruiting going on at Ole Miss, it was a chance Foley couldn't take, especially after a lot of the negative stuff surrounding Urban Meyer and the players he brought to Florida, and Will Muschamp's failure at coaching at Florida. It was another hire that Foley really needed to make sure he had a home run with, and after year one, it looks like it was a good choice. But it all goes back to what we heard with the negative with Hugh Freeze in that vaunted 2013 class.
Ironically, Hugh Freeze is somebody who is very outspoken and out front about his religious convictions, which obviously would fly in the face if these sorts of allegations are true and ethical standards compromised. The 2013 class is paramount to that reputation, but there's a little bit more out there. Certainly involving Hugh Freeze and speculation that he's not squeaky clean. Mike, your thoughts about Freeze's tenure at Ole Miss?
Well, I mean, if you look at, if you're familiar with the Michael Orr story, these allegations have followed Hugh Freeze ever since he was a high school football coach. And I'm not necessarily going to harangue Hugh Freeze's character. Oftentimes in the college football recruiting world, it's not so much how much you want to win as far as leadership and your character, it's how much you're going to allow other people to want to win. The best coaches, the coaches that don't get caught, the coaches that do things wrong and don't get caught, oftentimes have people do their work for them, and they would just rather not know. They lack what the NCAA calls institutional control. So they probably have a pretty good idea of what's going on the side, but in order to protect themselves and to maintain the character illusion, they let other people do things that, or they don't stay on top of what other people are doing to help the program. And sometimes you can help. Sometimes when you help the program, you're actually hurting the program if you get caught. So I don't know that Hugh Freeze is actually doing anything immoral or unethical, but there's a lot of signs pointing to there are people around the Ole Miss program who are doing things like that and not being reined in or managed by what essentially is the CEO of a multi-million-dollar corporation these days, which is a head football coach at an SEC school.
So the perfect segue, or we could call it in this case the imperfect segue, is what happened last Thursday night involving the prized recruit from 2013, one of several number one recruited players rated number one coming out of high school, going to Ole Miss, and then, bam, 3 years later, he is possibly the top-rated prospect, regardless of drafted position. Many experts considered him pound for pound the best player overall in the draft, and that's, of course, Mr. Laremy Tunsil. And if I remember the timestamp correctly, about 13 minutes before 8 o'clock in the start of the draft, 7:47, the draft was completely altered based on this Twitter feed, and also Laremy Tunsil's future, unfortunately, altered in a huge way as, again, a possible number 3 selection, definitely a top 5 guy, plummets to number 13 in the draft, still taken by the Dolphins as a top 15 pick, but cost him a ton of money, potentially a ton of money in litigation, financial advisement, everything that goes into damage control, and just trying to find the facts and come up with the proper story and get to the bottom of exactly what happened and find the perpetrators. Mike, this speaks to the the day and age that we live in, with social media controlling so much and having huge ramifications over people's lives, whether they are the ones to blame, the ones that initiated the issue, or they're just harmless victims.
Yeah, Mark, I talk a lot about the old days in college football, and I think the Laremy Tunsil situation was the perfect illustration of the convergence of social media or the new information age with college football, which oftentimes, particularly inside programs, are still kind of look back at the old days. When you look at players, look at what happened at Tunsil. Cardale Jones at Ohio State was a very active social media. Khalil McKenzie at Tennessee, of course, whose father runs the Raiders, he's very active on social media, both engaging with fans and politically. So I think that drives coaches nuts when players are active on social media, because they want the players to focus really just on the academics, the football, studying the tape, getting ready, and leave all that other outside world distraction alone. Well, when you have college-age kids, they're going to be on Snapchat, they're going to be on Twitter, and they're going to see everything out there. Not only are they going to see what the outside world is saying, but they're going to give the outside world a chance to see in the program. And, of course, fans love that access. So, and of course, with that access for the fans comes a lot of danger for the coaches and the program, distractions for the kids. So I think that drives coaches nuts. And then you saw the impact it had on Hugh Freeze. So it has an impact on the program and the coaches as well. Back in the day, Phil Fulmer or Steve Spurrier or Vince Dooley could go to these booster club rallies and they could make jokes and everything was okay because nobody printed it, it wasn't on video. Now, when Burt Bielema goes to Texas and makes a joke about the air raid offenses in the Big 12, the video is posted on ESPN. These coaches are upset, and so there's back and forth in social media. That stuff used to never happen. So again, distractions, it drives coaches nuts. There's goodness to it. It gives fans access. But there's badness to it too, because it brings people, it opens those doors to a lot of things that used to be closed in college football. The recruiting process, the booster speeches, what coaches say to kids on the practice field. I know at Tennessee you can get video of any open practice session. And so that's pretty enlightening for fans. So there's goodness to it, but there's badness to it too. I know it drives coaches nuts. The Laremy Tunsil situation was a perfect illustration of how it really hurt Hugh Freeze. It's probably going to hurt Ole Miss, at least reputational wise. Don't know if there's anything there with the NCAA, but definitely smoke. And obviously it cost Laremy Tunsil millions of dollars and some reputational issues. So just a perfect illustration of the convergence of the information age with college football.
David, if you're like me, the initial reaction was, what a knucklehead. Look at this. Bam. But then you process it and you figure within several seconds, okay, look at the timing of this. This can't be him posting it. Nobody's that stupid. He hasn't done this in the past. Why would he do it 10 minutes before the draft? But still, NFL teams have to be extremely guarded, protect their franchises, and they're scrambling like crazy trying to figure out what the truth is and what this really means. And by the time that happens, the clock's ticking, the selections are coming off the board, and Tunsil drops from most likely a top 5 pick down to 13.
Right, and you're right. It was kind of knucklehead moment, and you're right. It didn't take me long to figure out. You know what? This was not Tunsil. This was, the rumors of his stepdad, or now it's the financial advisor. There's a couple rumors out there of who this could be, and it seems like the Miami Dolphins may believe that it might be the financial advisor. It's a scary situation with the social media and these football players. It's at one point, Laremy Tunsil knew this phone was in his face. He's sitting there with a mask on and, smoking marijuana. And you have to think, with who you are, this video is probably not getting deleted, and it's going to go out sometime. And it came out at the worst possible time it could for him. And I just, I want to know and Mike brought it up, what is the black cloud now hanging over Ole Miss? How long does this go on? Does this hurt recruiting? What's Hugh Freeze's and Ole Miss's coaches' reputation in the SEC circles, and SEC coaches circles? We mentioned the article in Orlando Sentinel, the article, Mike Bianchi saying that Jeremy Foley didn't want to hire Hugh Freeze because of character issues. If he's right about that, what does Nick Saban think about Ole Miss? What does Brett Bielema? What is all these teams in the West that have to play Ole Miss each year? Mississippi State, of course, in-state. What's the cloud, and what's going to end up being the reputation of Ole Miss?
David, there are so many dark clouds out there and so many controversies, and the news cycle is running feverishly so fast and so much, and it seems like something not to this extent. This was huge. This is like a top 5 story for SEC football off the field for the year, certainly. But I just think there are so many stories out there, and we get a new one every few days that I don't think it quite has impact in the black eye that it does on a particular program. Because if you look around, not just the SEC, but around college athletics and college football, those black eyes, they're becoming quite common, and some programs have a second black eye because they're just so common. So, Mike, anything before we move on to the NFL draft?
Yeah, Dave, to answer your question, I don't think anybody's going to say anything publicly because all 14 schools live in glass houses. But clearly, if you look at the Sentinel's report, I think that's a knock to Hugh Freeze's reputation. A lot of people looked at that 2013 recruiting class and said, "How did Ole Miss pull this off?" That just kind of reinforces that. But I think where it gets nasty in the college football world is on the recruiting trail. These coaches aren't going to say anything. The only thing they're going to say is, "Hey, look at Ole Miss. If you're considering Ole Miss, it might be a tough couple years with the NCAA." And that's really where it gets cutthroat between the teams, is on the recruiting trail. That's going to be, if it hurts them at all, it'll be on the recruiting trail.
Hey, Mike, let's stay with you, and want to remind everyone that this is SEC Breakdown. We come your way every Wednesday night with the best in the SEC when talking about Mike Loveall and David Waters. I'm Mark Rogers, and again, SEC football each and every Wednesday night. So, big picture Mike here. We'll set you up with the NFL draft because I've got a question here regarding the SEC's prowess. Not as dominant as in recent years, but still at the top of the draft in regards to overall draft selections at 51. The Big Ten close behind at 47. If you look at the first, second, and third rounds, and then it tapered off for the other conferences, and the SEC actually had later picks that caught them up and allowed them to retain a somewhat of a title of drafting the most players each and every year. But in the SEC through the first 4 rounds, at least 28-23. Just your thoughts about, again, the big picture, if this gives any indication to the talent in the SEC moving forward or moving on to the NFL, of course.
Mark, what I think the draft shows is why the SEC is considered the strongest football conference. It's not because of the top end of the conference. It's not because we had the most picks. It's because we had depth spread across the conference. 13 of the 14 teams had a player drafted. The only team that didn't was Tennessee, a 9-win team that's returning 20-plus starters. Tennessee will return to the draft next year, guaranteed, with Cameron Sutton, Jalen Hurd if he comes out early. But if you look at the spread across the draft from the teams, the Big Ten was second with 47 picks. If you take away one team, 12 picks from Ohio State, then the Big Ten comes down to 32. So again, at the top of the conferences, there's a lot of parity. The best, again, looking at UCLA, 8 picks. If you take that away from the Pac-12, that puts them at 24. The top SEC teams only had 7. So I think the top of the leagues, there's a lot of parity. There's very good teams in the Big Ten. There's very good teams in the Pac-12. There's very good teams in the Big 12. And there's two really good teams in the ACC. But what the SEC draft shows us is the depth. Why the SEC is so strong is because the breadth and the depth of the talent. Those picks that you mentioned, the 4th, 5th, and 6th rounds, is what separates the SEC from the other conferences. It's a good conference, solid conference all the way through from 1 through 14. That's what people miss when you look at the stats in the NFL draft. They see the 51, more picks than anybody else, but what they don't realize is the breadth and the depth of the talent. 13 to 14 teams, no one big team that contributed to the chunk of numbers. That's, to me, the story of the NFL draft as it relates to the SEC.
Yeah, for as long as I've been watching the NFL draft, I'm still a bit amazed by the player analysis of production in college at elite schools versus what seems to project to the NFL. Of course, it's a bit of a guessing game and a crapshoot, and the number of players that had exceptional careers, very productive careers at elite programs who don't even get drafted, and then we see these freaks come out of other FCS schools even at times that get drafted high. Just the value of the program and the production versus the measurables at the combine and some other things. So Leonard Floyd takes the crown as the guy first drafted out of the SEC at number 9 by the Bears from Georgia. Not necessarily the best player in the conference, the best player possibly at his position certainly, but across the board, most people would say Vernon Hargraves, drafted a couple spots down from Tampa Bay, staying in state from Florida. So, David, anything stand out to you?
That Leonard Floyd pick, like you mentioned, did stand out to me a little bit. I know many Georgia fans. I grew up with Georgia fans, and they were, Mark, you mentioned, these big programs who the players don't really seem to do much in college, and they go on to do a lot more in the NFL. And Georgia's had a lot of defensive guys who fit that mold. They are so above average in college, and then they go to the NFL. Justin Houston, for example, go on and are very, very good NFL players. Leonard Floyd was very surprised to me to be the first SEC pick, partly because Tunsil's situation that happened there. And but I mean, I think it was a good pick. I think he can be a good player. It's just I didn't see him being the first player picking from the SEC. The Hargraves pick. Many Tampa fans were, they needed a secondary guy, and they went and got it. And Alabama, Florida led to SEC schools with 7 players apiece. And it kind of mentions, Florida, hasn't been winning as many games as in recent years, but are still, putting talent in the NFL. And I think that speaks to the job Will Muschamp couldn't do, and the talent he still brought in, and partly the reason why McElwain was still able to have a good season last year. The talent's still there, but it's I'll not to point out Florida is some interesting numbers that Florida's had a draft pick since 1952 in the SEC history. I just thought that was an interesting number that hasn't been floated around a lot, and so it's just I'll go back the Leonard Floyd pick, and like Mike said, the Tennessee didn't have draft picks, but I think people have to remember all the talent they bring back coming into this year, and all those guys will get drafted next year. Yes, it's rare for Tennessee not to have a player drafted 2 years in a row, but that speaks to a lot to what the bad situation Derek Dooley left them in, and now what Butch Jones has done to restock that talent and probably flood the draft next year.
Yeah, that was going to be my term right there, David. Flood the draft in the next few years from Tennessee. The one guy that I think really stands out in the first round, and it's easy to jump on the wide receivers typically because they produce numbers. They're the elite athletes, the guys that the fans love to watch make huge plays. So I'm not just jumping on it from that standpoint, but Laquan Treadwell, I think, was a great pick by Minnesota at 23.
That was my favorite pick.
To stay with our theme of character issues, you guys, Robert Nkemdiche, who's as talented as anybody out there, dropped all the way to number 30, still a first-round draft pick, goes to Arizona. They're a defensive tackle from Ole Miss in the famed 2013 class. Anything else out of you, Mike, on the NFL draft?
No, I think you bring up a good point about the players. You look at Eric Stryker out of Oklahoma, great college player, ended up not getting drafted. Just how you look at the needs of the team in the draft. When you look at the order, who's picked first and who's picked 13th and who's picked 9th, a lot of that depends on the needs of the team. And then you look at how talent translates from college to the NFL. Tommy Frazier, if you remember watching him in the 90s for those vaunted Nebraska teams, that was a classic example of a great, dominant college football player who just, for some reason the NFL didn't think would translate into the NFL. But sometimes that happens. Eric Stryker was this year's example of that. Very, very interesting how the NFL general managers and programs look at the translation of talent from college to NFL.
Yeah, the Tommy Frazier transition you can understand because of the quarterback play being so different, especially at that point in college football versus the NFL. But Eric Stryker, I thought that guy was a great player. He really shot onto the national scene with his performance against Alabama in the Sugar Bowl, but I had watched him that entire season prior to that, and I just thought, he was one of those Roy Williams types that played at Oklahoma and for the Dallas Cowboys who just would leap over left tackles and vault themselves onto quarterbacks that athletic off the edge, and boom, not drafted. So the NFL draft, the SEC, I'm sure that the league will not just continue to flood the NFL with players, but with impact players. But I did find it somewhat intriguing that some other leagues caught up. It may just have been a cycle of not a great year for SEC players, still at the top of the draft. So a down year for the SEC, but where the Big Ten was right there at 51-47 and outdrafted the SEC in the first 4 rounds. And as we know, the percentage of players that are able to make rosters and sustain careers, that second point being more prominent, drops considerably as you go down the drafting scale from the first round down to number 7. All right, our next subject, we'll have to keep it tight and maybe extend to other weeks because I think the three of us could talk scheduling forever. So right now, we know the current system in the SEC for scheduling with the 8-game schedule. Everybody plays everyone within the division. Then you've got the designated rival in the other division, and you've got the round-robin situation in picking up the 8th conference game. So, article by ESPN this week in which a writer proposed everybody goes into a one-division, one-conference standing of 14 teams, and basically the rivals are maintained, which there are various number of rivalries depending on the program and the school. And Mike, I'll let you start there in regards to your thoughts about the proposal, how you like the current system, and what you may tweak if it was up to you.
Well, I think the proposal, the SI article we're talking about, I think it's intellectually bankrupt. If you look at the proposal with having a rotational, it's really driven by rivalries. So if you look at who Tennessee, Florida, Alabama, Auburn, LSU, Georgia, they're going to play the same 4 or 5 teams because that's how rivalries are built. Rivalries are built on playing important games with big teams year after year after year. So consequently, logically it follows that those teams are going to be the best teams and they're going to play year after year after year. So what that would create is a bifurcated conference. You're going to have the top 4, 5, 6 teams playing the other top 4, 5, 6 teams every year, because that's where the rivalries are going to be generated. And then you're going to have the Vanderbilts, the Mississippi States, the Missouris, who are still good teams, but they're going to end up playing kind of each other every year as well. And then you have to figure out where Missouri and Texas A&M fits into that, because they don't have a lot of established rivalries. I just think that the article was intellectually bankrupt. I'm not a big fan of it. I'm one of those guys. I kind of like the 6-1-1 format. I like that. I don't necessarily think we need a change. If we do change it all, I would say every year rotate one team out of the division so that you can play 2 teams on a rotational basis out of the West. I will tell you, for the SEC, what I think needs to happen is move Alabama to the East and put Missouri in the West. People talk about moving Auburn to the East. I think the solution, the easy compromise, is moving Alabama to the East. A lot of people don't talk about that. That solves a lot of problems if you move Alabama to the East. Again, you've heard me say this 1,000 times. College football is a regional sport. It was born a regional sport. We don't have to have equal scheduling. The SEC playing a tougher schedule or playing 8 conference games versus the Pac-12 playing 9 conference games is okay. This isn't the NFL. It's not an NFL developmental league. It doesn't have to be centralized scheduling. We should embrace the vagueness. We should embrace the chaos that scheduling brings, because that's the essence of college football. That's why we love it. It's okay the way it is. But you've heard me say that 1,000 times. I just had to say it one more time.
And then another 1,000 times, Mike, you've heard me counter with examples like this. My daughter plays softball, and even when she was like 8 years old, they knew enough to play each team the same number of times so that they could even the schedule out and make it fair for everyone to compete for a championship. So when the first place team was awarded the first place medal, it actually meant something because everybody played each other the same number of times. So David, same question to you. I'll throw it out there. The proposal that we heard this week about the 14-team league, no divisions, your thoughts about the way it currently stands and how you may tweak it if you choose to.
I do like it with the getting rid of divisions, but I do agree with Mike that it does create where the good teams are playing the good teams and the bad teams are playing the bad teams. There would have to be a way to figure out, with the rotation, how, that could still equal out a little bit. Now, one reason I like the 9 conference games, but, I think everybody has to go to it. It can't just be pick and choose who wants to go 8, who wants to go 9. I think everybody has to do it. And the reason I like it is, I like good games. I'm tired of seeing the cupcakes. I'm tired of, Florida playing Presbyterian or UMass, and I like if it was me, it's a 9-game conference schedule, 9-game conference schedule, and you got your permanent opponents. However, if you have no divisions, how do you break that up? Is it 4 permanents and 5 rotational, or is it 5 permanents and 4 rotationals? That could be figured out. But I like good games. I like good on good. I'm tired of seeing the FBS versus the FCS. And yes, it's good for those small schools. If they have to keep 1, okay. I wouldn't mind seeing 9 conference games, 2 Power 5 opponents, and if you have to play a cupcake, play it. But I'd kick it to the curb as well. I'm an elitist when it comes to college football. I like these good games. There's nothing better, and we're seeing it more and more with this college football playoff, and it's these neutral site games, more and more that we're seeing the matchups that we've been yearning to see for years. The playoff is helping that. And speaking of the playoff, maybe it's time to already expand that 6, 8 teams, however you want to go. But it seems asinine. Hey, we have 5 Power 5 conferences, but only 4 get in.
Mike, for as much as I love to talk about this, you're ready to go. So we'll throw it back to you with the 4-team playoff.
Let me just go back to that thought about Alabama. If you move Alabama to the east, their average miles to each school only increases by 11 miles. Okay, and we'll still have 2 teams in the east that are west of an east school. Right now, you have Missouri and Auburn, or you have Auburn that's east of Vanderbilt, who's in the east. So a little bit of numbers that support that Alabama thing. Look, this whole expansion of college football playoffs, the more you expand the playoffs, the less you have to reduce the regular season. And then the regular season becomes less important. This is all I mean,
becomes more
we
important.
can argue about this. We can argue about this all we want. Everybody knows it's going to come down to money. Everybody knows the playoffs are going to expand because the TV networks are going to pay more money for more playoff games. But I like the BCS. We agree before the season, this is the metric that we're going to measure the two best teams. You can either schedule against that metric or you can not schedule against that metric and take your chance. But we all agree before the season, this is it. And then we let the season play out, and the two best teams in the country play each other.
The problem, Mike, is that wasn't a true
4, with 6, with 8, you get subjectivity.
That was a 1/3 metric.
I'm sorry?
Only 1/3 of the BCS was objective. The other 2/3 was voted on, so it wasn't a metric. It was still controlled by humans. That was the problem with the BCS. And when you talk about there being less games that would be important if you expanded the playoff, I remember a couple of years ago, 2013, there were only 2 teams basically that mattered as long as Florida State was going to hold serve against a weak schedule. Late in the season, basically the Auburn-Alabama game and Ohio State and Michigan State playing in the Big Ten championship. Those are the only 2 teams that had any shot of playing for a national championship, and it was down to those. Every other game, championship games, all the big games in the rest of the country meant nothing.
You are absolutely correct. The BCS was 66% subjective. The college football playoff selection, 100% subjective. So at least the BCS was a start in the right direction. Let's make it all metricized. Let's get rid of all poll voting. I'm okay with that.
You know what the ultimate metric is, Mike, is wins and losses. When a team wins, I know that that metric is pretty absolute. They won a game. Therefore, you give all conference champions an automatic entry into the playoff.
That's
all conference champions, or are you including P5? What about teams that finished runner-up?
Well,
how many teams are in football bowl subdivision?
I think you make a determination if you're going to talk group of 5. Do we include them or don't we include them? Now it's kind of like, well, if somebody's really good and they go 12-0 and everything else falls in their lap, there's a snowball's chance in hell that they can make it. But basically, no, we're not going to include them. Well, they either need to play for their own championship or they need to be included to some degree.
Yeah, I think that speaks to...
You know, I'm okay with that. My point is there's 120-something teams in the football bowl subdivision, and not all wins are created equal. I really don't think they are. So you could have a 12-1 team. You could have let's look at Stanford this year. Stanford went into the after the conference championship game. Stanford had 2 losses. They were much better than a lot of teams that had 1 loss. So when you have 128 teams, you're going to have a plethora of teams that have the same or similar records right there in that number 2 ranked to number 12 ranked team. If there's 4 teams in the playoff, what the argument is, we definitely need more teams because that number 5, number 6 team, Ohio State this year, could they have won the national championship in an 18 playoff format? They might have. I'm not going to say probably, but they might have. But my question is, okay, that number 8 team, what's to say that number 9 team wasn't just as deserving as number 7 or number 8 ranked team? Okay, well then let's expand to 12. And so if we have 12, what's to say that number 13 and 14 aren't just as deserving as 10, 11, and 12? It's a slippery slope argument.
I would go to a completely objective system in which it went to conference championships. Then there would be a metric if we wanted wild cards, just like the NFL, because there would be computerized scheduling that would have a 9-game conference schedule, and then the other 3 would be computerized. So pick your school. They wouldn't be out running around scheduling opponents. On May 1st, you talk about a big day in college football. On May 1st would be the schedule release, and everybody would find out, oh, Florida's got to play out of conference. They're going to play Michigan State, Kansas, and Oregon State, whoever.
Okay, but how do you protect
based on equity?
Okay, but how do you protect games Florida State, Georgia Tech?
Well, okay, they're a bad example because I would protect those games. I've gone through this, believe me, and I would protect those rivalry games. Yes,
I guess
definitely factored into it.
What we have to figure out is not when you look at this, you really can't just look at the SEC. It would need to be all of college football that needs to be adjusted. Is it, Mark, in your scenario, do you make 6 conferences with 10 teams, and there's your 6 teams? Do your 2 teams get a bye, and then you have a 14 playoff teams? Is that way? Do we get rid of the group of 5? Do they play in the spring? Do they play a separate division in the fall? Do you just have your top 60 teams who realistically have a chance of winning the national championship? Well, most people are going to throw out the Boise States of the world who don't say they deserve a chance even if they do go undefeated. It's not just the SEC that, when we start talking about what needs to happen, it's going to be a chain reaction that all conferences need, to join in and either abolish divisions and do all one pool, or create divisions in 6, 10, 10 leagues. It's going to be all the college football that has to do something for this to ever change.
I just don't know of another sport that exists on this planet where there are teams that in training camp we could tell them you can win every game by 3 touchdowns and you have absolutely no chance of winning a national championship. So forget it. I don't know why you're wasting your time.
Mark, that's because there is no other sport, and that's one of the things that makes college football the best sport.
That there are certain but Dave, from winning championships. That's a great thing. No, what makes college football great is the product on the field is unlike anything else. The system around it is idiotic.
But Dave hit on why that system is that way. To get equity in scheduling and to get equality across that way, you would literally have to blow up the whole system. And the reason is college football is like a house that was built on multiple foundations. So let's say you want to build a mansion. You just took 5 houses close to each other, and you just kind of patched them together into one big house. To get equity of scheduling, you would have to blow up the whole system and rebuild everything from one foundation. The foundation that college football is built on is regionalism. It was built 120 years ago. Football in the South was built in the SEC. Football in the West was built in the Big Pac-12. Football in the North was built in the Big Ten. And then the predecessor, the Big East. And then football in the Midwest was the Big Six and the SWAC. So it was built on these multiple foundations, and they grew independently, separate of each other, a loose confederation. What we've seen today is college football is much more of an entity, but it's built on the foundation of 6 or 7 of the conferences that were there from the beginning, and it's a patchwork confederation. That's why we don't have the equality of scheduling, because it's a regional product that has become a national loose confederation.
I'm only going to say 2 other things, then you guys can say whatever else you want about it, because I think we could go on all night, and I could for sure. So the one thing that we've talked about in the past, Mike, is the percentage of teams that make the playoff, because you've made the point, as you kind of did tonight, that 8 teams is too many for you. You like the format of 4 teams really earning those 4 spots. You think 8 provides teams opportunities that didn't necessarily earn it, and it would create maybe a log jam past that, and maybe teams 9 and 10 have just as good a resume as team number 8. Let's also consider, though, 8 teams out of 128. Look at the college sports and the professional sports. NFL 12 out of 32, Major League Baseball 10 out of 30. We've got the NBA 16 out of 32. College football, even if we expanded to 8, you're still talking about the very, very elite 8 out of 128 schools. The percentage is still microscopic compared to the other schools. That's the one point I'll make. And then just using this year as an example, if Notre Dame doesn't lose on the last play of the game 1 out of 2 times, so Stanford beat them last play of the game, Clemson beat them last play of the game, if they win one of those, we now leave out 2 conferences out of 5. I think that would be tragic. It already is leaving out 1 conference, but at least it's understandable when that 1 conference champion, Stanford, this year had 2 losses versus the 1 losses of the other conference champions. The year before, Ohio State kind of saved the committee because everybody didn't mind once Ohio State showed to be the best team in the country. But at the time, Ohio State, Baylor, TCU, all with 1 loss. Who in the world do you put in? All right, Dave. Anything else you got on this one?
I'll end on the playoff point. At least in the way I'll back up 4 teams as well. I don't want no more than 6. I think 8 is too many as well. 6 is weird because you would have a bye and all that kind of stuff. 4 teams, at least when one of those 4 teams wins, that champion is deserving. They did everything they needed to do to get there, and they deserved every bit of being called a champion. No matter how they got there, they're one of the 4 teams in. Only 4 teams, and you mentioned, yes, that's going to be the elite of the elite. One of those 4 teams deserves to hoist that trophy. They did what they needed to in the season, and you can't argue with whoever one of those 4 teams are.
So, okay, I'll make one more point. I know I promised the last point was the last point. So if you're the 8th ranked team in the country, and we expanded to 8 teams, and you're the 8th ranked team in the country, however we determine that team is number 8, they're at very worst, they're 11-2 going into this playoff, and then they will have to have beaten 3 of the 7 best teams in the country to win a national championship. Now, if that's not earning a championship, that's unlike any other sport. You got to beat 3 of the 7 best teams in the country to earn the championship after you've had an exceptional season.
I wouldn't hate it. Don't get me wrong.
Mark,
What's that, Mike?
Yeah, Mike.
Mark, one of the mistakes I think you were making in your earlier comments was you were comparing college football to professional sports. Let's look at college. Let's compare college football in the postseason to college sports, where you have 200+ basketball teams. You have I think almost 200 college baseball teams. But I'm not certain that comparing college football to the pro sports is really fair to college football. Here's the other point for you. If you want to look at pro sports, let's look at the year. And I forget the year. The year the Patriots went undefeated in the regular season, 16-0. Who was the best pro football team of that year? It was the New England Patriots.
Were most likely
Everybody
the best
knows
team.
that.
They didn't earn the championship. Just
So
like
who was
this past year, Alabama earned the championship on the field, but we don't know that they were the best team. We don't know that Alabama was the best team this year. They beat one elite team. We don't know that Alabama was the best team. They earned the championship, though.
And that goes back
I would say they beat more than one elite team. My point is, everyone knows that the Patriots were the best team that year, but the undisputed champion were the Giants because they won the one game that matters in the NFL. There's one game in the NFL that matters, the Super Bowl. Period.
End of story. 4 consecutive games against
they won
the 10 best teams.
They won the one game that matters, the Super Bowl.
Yeah, but they had to win a series of games to get there. They had to win 3 consecutive playoff games to get to that point.
And they only had to beat the best team in the league once.
See, in college football, we have a bunch of teams that are tied, and then people decide who the best one-loss team is to get in. In the NFL, it's at least objective that if your team's 9-7 and my team's 9-7, and we're tied for the last playoff spot, at least there's an objective system to let us know, okay, you get in because you earned it based on this criteria, not, let's throw 12 people in a room and they'll decide who the best team is.
That's because there's only 32 teams in the NFL. You can do that. There's 128 teams in college football. You can't do that.
Sure you can.
Again, that's why you can't compare college football to the professional sports. Much fewer teams, much different environment.
If you had equity in schedule, you could do it much better. All right.
Which means conference champions have to rule which means conference champions have to rule the world.
Yes, they should. They should rule the world. Let's take a conference champion that goes 9-3. I even think that they should be in it because nobody outside the conference has proven that they can beat that team. If the SEC champion next year goes 9-3, loses 3 conference games, wins the championship game, there's a log jam in the West, let's say. 3 teams are 5-3. They win the SEC championship game. I think that they should still get, not under this format, but under a true format, an objective format, that they should still get in because nobody outside the SEC proved that they could beat the SEC champion.
No, Mark, I think you have it backwards. If you have a conference champion that's 9-3, they've probably had an out-of-conference loss. Because if they're the conference champion, they probably have less conference losses than they have out-of-conference losses, or else they wouldn't be a conference champion at 9-3. And so what that shows is people outside the conference did beat the conference champion.
Well, we don't know. I'm just throwing out an example that has happened in major college. That team's gone at 9-3 and lost all those games in conference and still won the conference championship.
Probably a pretty weak conference, or a super competitive conference, one of the two.
Yeah, but it's happened. Anyway,
This is fun.
for Ohio State. All right, guys. Mike Loveall, David Waters, Mark Rogers. This is SEC Breakdown, and as you can tell, we love college football and we love it in the SEC, and would love to come your way every Wednesday night and love to involve you. So check us out on Twitter at SEC Breakdown as well. All right, guys, enjoyed it. We'll get together next week.
Sounds good.
Thanks, Mark.